Hi, my name is Sophie Grig. I'm a senior campaigner at Survival International, the global movement for tribal peoples. And I work on our conservation campaign, a campaign to decolonize conservation and against the human rights violations of Indigenous peoples in the name of conservation. And I'm really delighted to welcome Survival Ambassador Mya-Rose, also known as Birdgirl, to the Festival of Nature and to hear about the work that she's been doing.
Hi.
Hi. Great to have you on. And first off, I hear that you've got a book coming out exposing a lot of the things that we've been talking about, and it would be great to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, very excited. I've got a book coming out on the 3rd of August that is available for pre-order, called We Have a Dream. And the thought process behind it was basically that there are so many amazing young people out there campaigning to, for a better future, a better planet, but we were hearing the same few names over and over again, the majority of them being very white and very Western. And so because I knew there must be people out there that were doing great things, I decided that I wanted to write a book about 30 different young environmental activists of colour from all over the world. And one thing I wanted to do in particular was make sure that I was highlighting and giving a platform to various Indigenous voices from all over the world, because I think Indigenous peoples are very often ignored from climate change and conservation conversations, despite being on the front lines of all of these issues.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, actually, yeah, ignored and, their rights violated at the same time, and voices just not heard at all. Can you say a little bit about some of the people that you highlighted?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's funny because I started off the project with a very big list of people, and I thought it would be relatively easy. But for various reasons, people kept on dropping off, and it eventually became very difficult to hunt people down, which was sort of the purpose of the project. But I think it was quite sad when I did eventually find these people, because a lot of them just didn't have anyone talking about them or anything written about them. And there were people from all over the world. So I was able to talk to a few fairly well-known names in the scheme of things. So I spoke to the fantastic Autumn Peltier from Canada, who's had an amazing campaign for years now to do with rights and access to water for her local Indigenous community, her family, especially because water is incredibly sacred to their community. And she's been doing that since she's about 8 years old. She's now, I think, about 18. She's fantastic. Another more well-known name is Helen Gwalinga, who's from a village in Ecuador and has been fighting again for Indigenous people's rights in terms of the climate change movement and the conservation movement since she was very young. Someone fantastic that I talked to, actually, whose survival put me in contact with, was this amazing Indigenous young woman from northern India who, again, had been on the front lines of conservation, had been trying to protect the forests that her family, her community lived in and lived on, and had, again, been doing so for years. Because I think something that really struck me while writing this book, the common thread through it all, was just how young a lot of these people were when they started, especially the Indigenous activists, because it wasn't, I suppose it wasn't something that they felt they had a choice in. They were living in a community that was suffering. They were living with a family that was suffering. And so as children, they decided that they wanted to do something about it. And I think that sort of hints at the wider issues that a lot of people all over the world are currently dealing with, including children.
Absolutely. And I think for Indigenous people, they're so reliant on their environment, and they are, the evidence is increasingly showing what we've known all along, that they're the best environmentalists and the best conservers of their forests and their landscapes, yet they're so often marginalized in the name of conservation and thrown off the land that they're the best able to protect. And I know that you've looked into the racist origins of conservation, and that's obviously something that Survival has been campaigning on as well. And sadly, not the origins, but how those racist and colonial origins continue today. Great to hear a bit about what you found out when you looked into that.
Yes, I think so. I did a project, and I was writing that project for about a year and a half in the end, about again the origins of the conservation movement and how those are still in practice today. And I think for me, that was very eye-opening, especially because I wasn't hearing it from someone else. I was doing my own research, going into very old sources and things like that. And as someone who's always, I think my approach and my views on environmentalism and conservation had always been very English, like I'm English, very Western. So there were lots of things going on. And basically what I discovered was that what we think of in terms of the conservation model now was created in the late 19th, very early 20th century in the USA, of all places, which of course they have lots of these enormous, very famous national parks now, places like Yellowstone. And there are a few different reasons that this was done. People like President Teddy Roosevelt had immense, they were immensely pleased with, just the nature of America. But one thing that they weren't pleased with was the original people that lived there on these lands. So there were, without going too deeply into it, there was lots of different eugenics thoughts basically becoming extremely popular within America at this time, and at the same time people were talking about how essentially Native American people were extremely lazy, and the reason that they felt that they were lazy because they didn't spend all day working. People were plowing the fields, they were chopping down forests, things like that. Well, these people were able to spend time just relaxing and spending time with their family because they knew the land well enough to not need to spend the whole day hunting to go and find food, to not need to spend the whole day fishing to feed their family. And at the same time, people like Teddy Roosevelt were very, very into hunting. He loved shooting down all the deer and things like that. And they began to realize very quickly that they were running out. They were running out of deer. And so they decided the best thing to do to preserve this amazing land that they loved was to remove all the indigenous people from it, because they were killing animals for food, and that was seen as barbaric. But within several decades, they had to implement a deer cull within various national parks because they were overrun. And I think that's what a lot of this boils down to. And that's something I had to think about quite a lot, is that I think with conservation, we're always searching to create this idyllic landscape free of humans, free of destruction. And something I really had to realize was that there is no such thing, because humans have shaped every landscape we've ever lived in. Places like the Amazon that we think of as being very untouched have totally been shaped by human hands. They've been farmed for hundreds of years, just not in the way that we think of farming. And I think it's only when you come from a perspective that's a bit less white and a bit less Western is when we'll be able to be doing conservation effectively, basically.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And that sort of whole model of, and the whole idea of wilderness, if you could eradicate one sort of concept from conservation to make a big difference, wilderness would be it. This idea that, a wilderness is a place without people, which is such a nonsense, because it's the people who have lived there and shaped those environments and know it the best, but then they don't fit into other people's perceptions, and they certainly didn't fit into Teddy Roosevelt's perception of what a wilderness should be and what a sort of landscape should be, because there were these sort of people in the way. And we still see that, across in conservation across Asia and Africa particularly, all the sort of the photographs and the safari advertisements, you never see any people, you never see, that's because those people have been cleared, or they're sort of pushed to the side and excluded from those areas. The areas that they're the best people to conserve them.
And that's the thing as well. These are people who have managed to conserve these landscapes for thousands and thousands of years, compared to, I know in the UK at least, we'd destroyed the majority of our biodiversity by the late 19th century. But something that really struck me when reading some of Roosevelt's old diary entries was the way that he talked about people versus nature, because he was always, I think he really enjoyed the majesty of nature. And to clarify, when I'm talking about Roosevelt, he kind of summarizes how many of those great naturalists of, you know, the 20th century felt about things. People like John Muir, who's famous for setting up the national parks in America. And he talks about, you know, the majesty of the brown, you know, the bears and the beautiful old trees and how old and grand, how much they must have seen, things like that. Well, at the same time, the language that he uses to describe the indigenous people of that land is far more dehumanizing than the language that he's using to describe animals and predators. And I think that is very telling. And I brushed on it briefly earlier, but when I was talking about eugenics, another reason that these people were removed from the land under the guise of protecting it was just, in fact, with the goal of eradication. Many of John Muir's close friends at the time and colleagues were very, very into eugenics, basically, and were in fact cited by the Nazis a few decades later. And I think that's very, very telling. And again, you're seeing very similar things happening in Asia and Africa at the moment, where, for example, you have people talking about how, you know, these forests are being destroyed, people are poaching in them all the time, you know, people are creeping onto the land to like kill all the animals. And it's like, but this person 20 years ago lived on this land and they've just hunted here this whole time because this is their land. And if it wasn't for all these external factors, there would be nothing wrong with the hunting because it's what they and their family have done, again, for hundreds of years. And I think that's the bit that people forget. And I think the whole narrative around poaching, which is always used as one of the big scares when we're talking about conservation, totally needs to be rethought.
Absolutely. And the people who end up being the victims are the people who are hunting to feed their families, and they're called poachers, whereas the big game hunters and the people that are coming, which is often funding a lot of the conservation industry, and organizations like WWF actually are not opposing that sort of hunting, but they do that quite quietly because it doesn't really fit in with the, you know, with the way that most of their supporters feel about those things. But whereas the people who are hunting sustainably, and, you know, it's no coincidence that the place where you have this wildlife and this amazing biodiversity is almost always where Indigenous people live. 80% of the most biodiverse places on Earth are the homes of Indigenous people. And those are the people sustaining those things, yet they're the ones called poachers or encroachers and seen as a danger to the environment. And so you get these conservation organizations like WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, with such a long history, right back working with, you know, at those Teddy Roosevelt sort of days of eugenics, and, you know, right up to today involved with supporting evictions of tribal peoples in India from tiger reserves. And you can see that transition just continuing on. And it, you know, it's absolutely vital to stop that. And I think, you know, people like you getting involved, young people challenging that and saying, you know, it's racist, and, you know, calling out the racism in conservation and that sort of racist idea that, you know, that you've got these sort of white saviors, particularly in Africa, sort of coming, and these great sort of heroes of conservation, and the people who are actually on the ground conserving things by themselves are being booted out.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think quite often when you bring up these issues, people get very defensive for various reasons. I mean, organizations like WWF, which is just the biggest organization, all of these conservation organizations are doing this, you know, they're fairly universally beloved. But I think one of the things that I really want to clarify when talking about these issues is it's not just kicking up a fuss for the sake of it. It's important for the people that we're talking about, but it's also really important for the sake of conservation as well. Because conservation is at the moment genuinely shooting itself in the foot by refusing to work with local and Indigenous peoples. And I think it's slowly becoming a little bit more recognized that working with local peoples is incredibly important for conservation, because programs like just aren't effective without the cooperation of the people around you, but less so with Indigenous people. And I genuinely, personally can't understand why, because again, these are the people who have been preserving their land, because it is their land, for very, very long periods of time, and who in a lot of the time understand the land better than the people who are coming in trying to save it. But I think there is still this feeling of Western superiority that's totally coming into play. And I think older example, going back to America again, is of course the Californian wildfires have, in my opinion, totally been caused by ignoring Indigenous people's voices in conservation, because the local people in that area used to do systemic burnings of the forest because it was very important for regeneration, and it was very important to prevent massive wildfires spreading across massive areas, which you're now seeing. A similar thing happened in Africa, where poaching of elephants in a certain national park was stopped, which had been done again by the local people for a very long time, and within a couple of decades an elephant cull had to be put into place. And so I think the bit that people forget is that by involving Indigenous people, not just in the conversation, but involving them in the project and listening to what they have to say and listening to their expertise, is going to be so important in terms of the future of conservation and managing to actually save the things that we in theory want to conserve.
Absolutely. And actually the studies have shown that where you've recognized Indigenous people's land rights, and so they have control over their land and know that it will be there for their children and their grandchildren, that is the best way, and that's where you get the lowest deforestation, the fewest number of wildfires, and all of the greatest amount of biodiversity. And so by recognizing land rights, and then having the conservationists coming in and say, how can we help you, rather than imposing something on them and saying, you'll be allowed to join the conversation, sometimes. You're actually recognizing their rights to the ownership of their land and respecting their incredible knowledge.
Absolutely. And I think as well, something else to keep in mind, especially in situations where Indigenous people have managed to gain official ownership, like legal ownership of their land, is that even if conservation organizations don't particularly want to talk to them, things like logging companies always are. So for example, when I went to Bolivia, when I was a kid, I remember there was this amazing massive stretch of forest that was it wasn't even preserved because it had just never been damaged in the first place. And about 10 years before I went, the local Indigenous people who owned that land had nearly sold it. They'd nearly signed a deforestation contract because they literally didn't have another option. And there was no conservation organization that ever approached them, although that would have been perfect. But instead, someone from that village who'd learned about various conservation things had instead encouraged them to start an ecotourism business on the land, and that's how it became preserved. But I think people forget as well, these aren't like mythical other people. They are people, and they need food and they need money. And when, again, you're not involving people in conservation, you're not allowing them to have any say over their own land, you're not allowing them to, I suppose, contribute to that conversation, which is totally linked into the future of them as a community in general. That's also when you start alienating people.
Yeah, and so many Indigenous people have such a close spiritual connection to the land as well. So the thought of it being destroyed is so painful to them. And I've recently been talking to some Genu Karuba who live in Nagahole Tiger Reserve in India, and they say, who's better able to protect this forest and the tigers that live in it? Us, who worship the tiger, we worship the spirits in the forest, or the forest guards who are frightened of the animals and only approach them if they have a gun? And you just think, yes, I think you might be a better placed to do that. And to do that, you have to recognize their rights and challenge this whole notion of conservation and talk about climate justice. And I think the media has failed. And I think one of the important things about your book is that you're ensuring that the voices of local communities and Indigenous people who are ignored by the global media and the conservationists and the whole narrative of sort of global climate change. And it's really important that their voices are heard too.
Absolutely. And I feel like, again, We Have a Dream is particularly interesting this year because it's COP26 in the autumn, and there's so much potential for really interesting conversations around climate change, around there's also the biodiversity COPs also around biodiversity and preservation of land and things like that. There's so much potential for really interesting conversations, and I feel like involving these various people from all over the world is going to be so important. And in terms of climate change in general, because a lot of the young activists in the book are very involved in anti-climate change things. Again, it's people who are living on the front lines of these issues. So, for example, I spoke to a few different people from a few different Pacific islands who were teenagers, like they were teenage boys, and even in their lifetime, they could see how the days had gotten hotter, how the sea level had risen, how the coral had bleached. I think in pretty much every situation, these are people who are on the front lines, who are seeing this destruction for themselves. And I think in some ways it was really heartbreaking, because these all were people who were just so young and so desperate when they started. But I think at the same time, personally, it made me feel quite hopeful for the future, because again, these are people that just care so much and just want to make the world better and more livable. And I think, I don't know, that just made me very hopeful, I suppose.
Yeah, and to ensure that their voices are heard, and the voices, it's not just the WWFs and big conservation organizations who ignore the voices of Indigenous people that are heard in these big climate conferences and other events that are happening this year. And the people who are suffering either from climate change or attempts to mitigate climate change by, for example, in doubling the number of protected areas, which is being touted as a great solution, the 30 by 30 solution to help stop climate change. The very same people who've done the least to create climate change are the ones who are going to suffer from it the most.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to prioritize those voices from the global south. Like I know in Bangladesh, where my family is from, there are already over 4 million climate change refugees in Dhaka, the capital city, and it's only going to get worse. And I think so. For example, I think it's this weekend that G7's happening, and these are essentially the 7 countries who have gotten together and decided that they're the most important 7 countries in the world. And obviously there isn't anywhere from the global south, and they're all going to be having conversations about really important issues like climate change and how they're going to combat those going forwards. And so I suppose on a global and international political level as well, I think it's so important to be prioritizing those countries and their own feelings, especially when a lot of places like Bangladesh are actively coping with things like climate change at the moment. It isn't some dystopian future, it is absolutely the now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the people who are attending the Festival of Nature, or virtually or physically, it's really important that they learn about this from the other side, because I think the media, the narrative that you get in the media, the narrative that's pushed by the conservation organizations, the businesses, all these solutions that sound so simple and actually don't involve any major change to the capitalist society or people's in the West's and the North's way of life. We can carry on doing exactly the same thing, but the people whose Pacific Islands are being drowned, or the people whose lands will be taken over by conservation to mitigate against climate change, those are the people who are going to suffer. So it's so important that people listen, hear those voices, listen to the voices of Indigenous peoples, reading your book, finding out about Survival International's campaigns. And, I think it's a great place to start to read and hear the voices of Indigenous peoples and other peoples of colour who are speaking out against these issues.
Absolutely. And I think for anyone who's interested in reading more about any of these issues, there is so much information on Survival's website. But I think also, if you have the time, go out and do the research for yourself, not literally from primary sources like me, but go out and read a few articles and figure out what you think about things. Because I think what we need really is an environmental movement who understands these issues and who cares about these issues going forward.
Absolutely. One that puts the rights of Indigenous peoples and other communities who are facing the real crisis of climate change and puts them at its heart.
Absolutely.
Great. I think we've run out of time, but it's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on and having this chat. And, you know, I think it's so important that people learn about this. And, you know, it's great that people from the Festival of Nature will be able to hear and learn more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a really interesting chat.
Well, it's been a pleasure.